It was about late November in Colorado, and I was about 7 or 8, and my father got the idea of taking us all for a weekend to a cabin that he was going to rent. My mother thought it was a great idea for me, my sister, my father, and my mother to bond. So that's exactly what happened. We rented a cabin for a few days. We took off school on Friday to get a head start on getting there, which I had no issue with. Upon arriving, it was incredibly cold. We got all set up and decided where we'd all sleep. We ate dinner, and then we all set up for bed and were thinking about what we'd do tomorrow. We got there kind of late, so we couldn't do much for the first day. That night, though, I heard noises outside, and it kind of sounded like footsteps. I looked out the window and saw nothing, so I figured it might have just been an animal. I tried to go back to sleep, but about 15 minutes later, I heard it again. I woke my sister up, which she was about 11 at the time, and she heard it as well. We both walked over to the window and saw something out there. We weren't quite sure what it was. We decided it best for it not to see us, so we went back to sleep. I had a hard time sleeping that night, and so did my sister. But when we eventually woke up, my mother was inside making breakfast, and my father was outside. I asked my mom if I could go outside with my dad, and she told me sure, while my sister stayed inside and waited for my mother to finish breakfast. I walked outside, and my father was talking to some man, a short, chubby man. He had a shaved head and was wearing a veteran cap. He looked really nervous too for some reason. He was sweating a lot as well, even though it was freezing outside. I walked over to him and my father looked at me and said, "Oh, this is my son," and told him my name. The man looked at me and said, "Nice to meet you, kid. My name's Patrick." He smiled and looked at me. I smiled and greeted him back, and it may have been rude at the time, but I was just a kid and asked him, "You look kind of scared. Are you all right?" And he kind of coughed and replied, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just went through some shell shock. I'm a veteran," he said, as I couldn't already tell with the cap he was wearing, and he seemed relatively normal then. My father seemed to really like this guy, and I liked him too at first. He told my father he had also rented a cabin with his family and that they were really close to us, so he decided to introduce himself. My father invited him inside for breakfast, and he stayed, and everything was normal. I went outside to play after that with my father and Patrick. While outside, I fell and scraped my knee and started crying. My father was inside at the time, a bad time for him to be inside. My mother was calling for him, and he ran inside while I was out there with Patrick. Patrick ran over to me and told me to come with him to his cabin because he had band-aids. I agreed and went with him. I wasn't the smartest kid. I went with Patrick, and we talked about what I liked doing, and I told him about video games that I played and stuff like that. Then things got weird. He asked me what shoe size I was and how old I am. I didn't know what my shoe size is, and I told him, but I told him my age. He just kind of chuckled and said something along the lines of, "Good to know." Also, his cabin was nowhere near ours. It was way back. It took about 20 to 25 minutes to walk there. I was tired and there was no point in getting the band-aid anymore, but I still decided to keep going since I had walked so long. We entered the cabin, and he told me to go in first, so I did. As soon as I walked in, I realized something. There was nobody in there. No family. I asked him where his family was, and he didn't answer, pretending like he didn't hear. He locked the door. I immediately felt mildly frightened. He told me, "I'll be right back with the band-aid, kiddo." He walked into the kitchen and pulled one out of somewhere, and then walked back and told me to have a seat and he'd put it on. I sat down and he put it on me. He also held my leg with his other hand and rubbed it up and down and told me, "You're rather muscular, kid. I like that." I kind of got scared and immediately stood up. He asked me what was wrong and I told him nothing and that my leg was feeling much better. I then thought my parents must be worried sick about me and that I should hurry back. He insisted that I stay a little longer and ate there. I didn't want to, but I was alone and if I ran, I don't think I could find my way back to my cabin. The door was locked too, so I just agreed and decided to eat with him and get it over with fast. He asked me how much I weighed, and I guessed around 73 pounds. He then had a smile go across his face. He nodded and said, "Perfect weight." I asked him perfect weight for what, and he just kept smiling. I was really weirded out and asked him if I could go. He told me no, and that things were just getting started and I shouldn't miss out on the fun. He had such a weird tone when he said that too. I then heard a big bang come from the bedroom. It was the closing of a door. Patrick stood up and looked kind of angry. He walked into the room and shut the door behind him. I then heard him yelling, "Did I fucking tell you that you could move? No. Stay the fuck where you are. I have fucking company." Or something like that. He then walked out with a smile on his face and shut the door slowly. "Sorry about that. It was just my wife. She's really sick and not allowed to be near visitors today." He was smiling while saying this. I wanted to go more than ever. I then looked around the room and noticed there were clothes everywhere, and it was really messy. He must have been living out here. At that moment, his wife walked out of the room. "I'm hungry," she said. He looked pissed. "Get back in there," he said. His wife was extremely pale and looked like she had been crying a lot. She was sniffling and had red circles around her eyes. She looked at me, then walked back into the room. I asked him where his kids were. He didn't answer. He told me he had kids' clothes that he wanted me to try on. And that was the last straw. I had to get out of that situation and I didn't know how. I started crying and then he hugged me. He told me, "It'll be okay, little one. Nothing is going to happen. Just try on these clothes." He walked into the back room. I thought that was the perfect time for me to leave. I unlocked his door and tried to leave as quietly as I could. I didn't care if I got lost anymore. I didn't want to take any more chances with Patrick, if that even was his real name. I had a feeling he had been lying. He lied about having kids, so who knows what else. I was in the woods trying to find my way back. I was still close to his house, close enough to hear shouting. I heard him yelling stuff to his wife, things along the lines of, "Where the fuck did he go? And I knew I shouldn't have left him alone. You probably let him leave." I could have sworn I heard him call her whore and bitch a couple of times. Then it happened. I stopped in my tracks. I heard footsteps, and I went and hid behind a tree and looked in his direction. He was outside and seemed to be looking for me. I was far enough away to where I could barely see him, but I could tell he was looking for something. He then stepped out into the forest and I heard him shouting, "Hey kid, it's okay. You can come back now. You don't have to try on the clothes. And I have toys back in the cabin. All you have to do is come back." I then ran. I ran as fast as I could in a straight line in hopes to find somebody or anybody that could lead me to my family. I was running away, and I thought I heard shouting, but I didn't stop to listen. Then after about an hour of running, I saw a cabin. My cabin. I ran to it. My father was outside looking around, looking for me. I ran up to him crying and told him Patrick wasn't a good guy and that he was really weird and was touching my legs. My father immediately called the person he rented the cabin from, and he said that nobody had rented that cabin. My father looked at me square in the eyes and told me to never follow any stranger ever again. We immediately left that day and asked for a refund for the next day. The guy renting them out apologized. The man having the cabin rentals called the police, and the police went back there and checked the cabin, but there was nobody back there, not even his wife. They told us that his clothes and belongings were still there. Nothing really happened after that. They asked questions and left. They never called or told us anything about him ever again. Patrick most likely wasn't his real name, and he probably wasn't a veteran. I just want to know what happened to him and his wife, and how he even got a wife in the first place, and how and why he lived back in that cabin. He seemed to have lived there for a while. I guess he left because he figured the police would have been coming after him because he didn't rent the cabin. So many questions that will never get answered. I'm just glad that it's all over, and I hope I never have to see that cabin man again. So, back when me and my big brother were still fairly young, our parents weren't exactly very well off. Mom had been out of regular work for more than 2 years due to the childbirths and needing to take care of us, and my dad was still basically at entry level for his career. But because they worked so hard on carving out a life for us as a family, they were in dire need of a vacation. Only thing was, because of our financial situation, it had to be a real budget vacation, which is how they found this cheap log cabin in the Cascades that was available for just over $100 a week. From what they've told us, it wasn't like it was one of those too good to be true kind of deals. There wasn't anything remotely suspicious about a place so rough around the edges. But from what the owner told them, it was quiet, secluded, and well off the beaten path, so the perfect place to get some peace and quiet away from the hustle and bustle of Seattle. I think all it took was making sure it was safe for kids, ensuring that there were no bodies of water around or anything, and then they went ahead and booked it for 5 days in June or July. I was really into animals and nature stuff back then, still am really, and my brother was a pretty chill kid, so they could have taken him anywhere and he'd have found something to keep himself occupied. So when we arrived out at the cabin, we were both pretty excited with our new surroundings, even if it meant that we had to share a bed in a small, rustic-looking one-room cabin. We didn't care if it was too small or if it was in the middle of nowhere. It was like a real adventure to us at that age. Being so immersed in nature was something I found really exciting. The first day, we arrived in the early afternoon, and I remember running around the cabin with my mom before she took me and my brother out to explore the surrounding area. We had a small dinner that my dad cooked on the stove with groceries we'd bought, and then we ended up playing board games until it was time for bed. Everything was perfectly normal for that first day, and it was only during the night that I noticed something seemed to be off. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to find that my dad was out of bed and was over by the small window near the cabin's front door. Mom was sat up in bed, whispering to him in the low light. My brother stayed fast asleep as I asked them what was wrong and why Dad was out of bed. I remember both of them kind of jumping when I spoke, but I did surprise them, so that figured. They told me Dad couldn't sleep, how the bed was too small or something, so he was just letting Mom get some sleep before he went to bed himself. I do remember thinking that was kind of weird, as the bed looked big enough for me, but at that age, kids just kind of take their parents' word over stuff like that, don't they? So as they continued to whisper to each other in the darkness, which I actually found very soothing even though I shouldn't have, I just went back to sleep. The next morning, Mom and Dad were sat at the little table looking all worried and stressed about something. I could tell something was wrong, even at that age, but I was still excited to be on vacation, and I was definitely excited to get back into the great outdoors to try to spot some animals. I asked if I could play outside, and my parents said it was okay, just as long as I didn't go anywhere they couldn't see me from the window. If I couldn't see the window, I'd gone too far, and that's what they told me. So I opened up the cabin door, walked outside, and on the edge of the porch was what looked like this little figurine. It was shaped like a tiny little man, and to me, it looked like it had been carved out of wood or something. I remember picking it up and playing with it for a little while, making the little guy run through the grass and jump out onto logs and stuff. Then the next thing I know, I saw one sitting on the hood of Mom and Dad's car, so naturally I ran over to grab that one too, so I had two little stick men to play with. I was in the middle of my little game when my brother came outside. He's older than me, and back then he was definitely more attuned to Mom and Dad's moods. He told me something was wrong with them, that they seemed worried or sad about something, which made me sad too because it was supposed to be a happy little vacation for us, an adventure, just like they'd said. I remember being it much harder to have fun after that, knowing that Mom and Dad were stressed or whatever, but still, I showed my brother the new toys I had and invited him to play along with me. I gave him one of the little figurines, but then he kept asking to play with the other one too, and it wasn't long before a childish scuffle started between him and me, and he attempted to wrestle the little figure out of my hand. It didn't take long before I started to cry, and that then prompted our Mom and Dad to come running out of the cabin at the sound of my cries. I don't remember them running out with any particular urgency, but years later they told us that the sound absolutely terrified them, especially in light of what had happened the night before. They asked what we were fighting over, and that's how they discovered the little white figures we'd been playing with. But right when my dad took them from my big brother, he immediately started asking us all frantically, "Where did you get these? Tell me where." He was so angry that my brother started crying too and just pointed at me while he said that it was me that had found them. I was already upset, but I remember getting even more upset once I realized that we might be in trouble for having played with them. I told Mom and Dad exactly where I'd found them, that they'd just been sitting there and how I hadn't stolen them or taken them from any other kid or anything. It seemed totally harmless to me, just playing with little wood-carved figures. I had no idea that they weren't made of wood at all. The next thing I remember, Mom and Dad had rushed us back into the cabin, then weirdly changed their approach as they reassured us that we weren't in any trouble, that we hadn't done anything wrong, and that they weren't mad at us at all. Mom proceeded to comfort me and my brother, but then I noticed how Dad was packing all of our stuff back into our suitcases at like 100 miles an hour. He was the same way, making sure to put on a brave face as he got us ready to get out of there. And then they both explained that they had to take us home early because Dad needed to go back to work on something. I can't remember the exact excuse, but they promised us that it wasn't because we'd misbehaved or anything, and we could carry on playing in the backyard when we got home. I asked if we could take the little figures home with us, and both of them almost snapped at me when they said no right at the same time. Again, I associated this with me having done something wrong, as the whole episode seemed to be centered around the two white carvings. Within maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I'm not sure, but I know it was fast, we were back in the car and driving back to Seattle again, with this real tense mood in the car as we drove. It was still pretty tense for the rest of the day, but then the next, Mom took us out into the small backyard that we had and told us that we could have our very own little nature play session right there. It was only a small backyard, but we still had fun watching for birds, and we were in the suburbs at the time, so just seeing the odd squirrel made me and my brother so excited. Then we had a little picnic, ran around the grass in the sun, and within a day, all the trouble back at the cabin was forgotten about among me and my brother. So, cut to like 20 years later. It's during the holiday, and me and my brother had come home to have Christmas dinner. We're sitting around reminiscing in the TV room, talking about this and that, when my brother suddenly brings up the aborted cabin vacation from when we were kids. He hadn't forgotten about the two little figures, but he wasn't entirely sure if I had stolen them or not, or why Mom and Dad seemed to get so weirdly mad about me finding and playing with them. Mom and Dad gave each other this look as if to say, "Here goes." Then I remembered Dad being like, "Shall you tell them or shall I?" Mom just shook her head and covered her face with her hands like she couldn't bear to remember the whole thing. That's when Dad launches into the actual story of what happened back then, a story that I'll share with you too. So, remember I mentioned waking up in the middle of the night and seeing Dad out of bed, and he and my mom were whispering to each other in the low light? That was because, as they were drifting off to sleep, Dad had heard someone moving around outside the cabin. Not like just walking by either. The footsteps were slow and careful, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. That's how Dad ended up peering out of the window so late at night, and although I didn't see it at the time, he had this old kitchen knife in his hand, just waiting for someone to burst through the door. That had scared them both pretty badly, but they didn't want to just bail on the vacation they'd already paid for, the one they both felt that they needed so badly. So although they were in two minds about it, they decided to stay one more night just to make sure that it wasn't some kids messing around or something. If it happened again, they were just going to leave. But they didn't even get that far, because right around the same time that they were discussing whether to stay another night, the incident with the little figurines happened. Remember me telling you how they looked like they were carved from wood, but that the wood was all pale, like almost white? It wasn't wood at all, and my dad almost instantly recognized that the little figurines were made of bone. I'm not going to pretend to know which bone or what kind of animal they came from. I mean, God forbid they came from a person or whatever. But like I said, Dad was smart enough to recognize the texture and realize that whoever had been outside the previous night must have left them there, maybe even as a warning. I mean, you don't leave bone figurines on someone's porch as a welcome gift, do you? Not in the middle of the night, anyway. So instead of sticking around like they thought they might, they just, as they say, noped out of there. Like my dad figured that he could protect my family from some lone peeping Tom, but from someone who carved stuff out of bone to leave his creepy gifts, that wasn't anyone he wanted to go up against. Personally, I think that that was a smart move, and I respect them for making the hard decision that they had to. Now, 90% of horror movies are the dumb teens just not taking the hint about being somewhere that they're not supposed to be. But in real life, when you have your kids around to protect, there's no thinking it over at all when stuff like that hits the fan. You just get out of there and don't look back.